Frankie, and I'm going to be talking tonight a little bit about a wee cycle trip that I did. I've got a few photos to show you, so I'm going to put them up on screen, but then I'm also going to take them down at some points and talk to you rather than just having the slides up the whole time. So I'll just share my screen now. There we go, and hopefully you should be able to see this slides up there. So this is me and my bike Gwen, and let me just move this over. We cycled the amazing distance from Shoreham by Sea to Shoreham by Sea. We went the long way round. So I cycled 3,175 kilometres, starting on the 15th of August, through some of the worst weather I've experienced in my life, and finishing 71 days later. I'm just going to stop sharing whilst I tell you a little bit more about it, and a little bit more about the why. Along the way, I interviewed and spoke to women and non-binary folk who are older than myself, who still continue to prioritise adventure and the outdoors as part of their life. And I did this because I live quite an adventurous life. You know, I love climbing and hiking and spent time living in a van, but I don't always see myself doing it forever. And I think that's because I don't always see stories of people who I resonate with doing it. But then every time I do meet someone who's older than me and is still getting outside and still doing these things that, you know, fuel my soul, it just fills me with hope. And I thought that maybe if I feel that way, other people do too. So I put a post on Facebook and I was quite anxious because I didn't really know if this would resonate with anybody. But I told myself, if I just get 6 answers, then I'll go and visit those 6 people. I'll interview 6 women and I'll talk to them. This post got over 150 comments. And then I just had this huge job of trying to work out a random squiggly route around the country that would manage to fit in as many of those people as possible. I think now's a good time to give you a bit of context. I'd never really cycled before, and I bought my bike in lockdown. And I'd never done a multi-day trip, so I didn't really have any clue what I was doing. On day 1, I didn't know how to use my nav device or plan a route, and I got lost. I'd not tested any of my kit, and it fell to pieces and my bike broke, and it was chucking it down with rain. 20 kilometres in to my first 60 kilometres, and I had to tap out and phone my girlfriend to come and pick me up in the van. I was completely devastated. I'd sort of put so much emphasis on myself that if I can get through day 1, I can get through anything. So not getting through day 1 really floored me. But I got up and I carried on, and I wanted to go ride that section, but I had an interview at 9 AM the next day. So I just got up, fixed my bike, went to the interview and carried on. And I'm so glad that I did. I'll just pop back to my slides now. There we go, I think you can see them. So you might be wondering how I was doing it and where I was sleeping. I spent a large amount of time camped out in people's gardens. This was on around day 4 of the trip when I was in Bournemouth. I spent some time in campsites. So by this point, I'd made my way back up to Bristol. Occasionally, I had some very uncomfortable wild camping moments. This was actually in Scotland, so I'm not breaking any rules here. And a large amount of the time, I would stay in my girlfriend's van. So I would cycle during the day, we'd meet up, I'd stay in the van overnight, and then we'd carry on the next day. Quite often, we'd stay in beautiful places like this, but also sometimes we just slept in the van outside our friends' houses, and we'd get out in the morning and sort of say hello to commuters as we hurried into their house. a great example of that is when we stayed in Bristol. And then I want to take you forwards into Wales. So this photo was kind of taken in a real highlight of the trip for me. It's something that I think will resonate with a lot of people here. There's a feeling that you get in your first big human-powered trip when you look back and all of a sudden realize quite how far your body has taken you. At this point, for me, I'm usually based in Reading. Getting to Wales is a long drive. So to think that I had been able to get to Wales using only my own power was just amazing. And it's a feeling that so many of the women that I interviewed and spoke to have shared as well. Talking about them, I'll share a little bit more information about some of the women that I spoke to as part of the trip. So I spoke to women up and down the country doing all sorts of different sports and activities, accessing the outdoors in different ways. A couple of examples here, Shadi, who is a mountaineer and started mountaineering in her 40s. Soraya built her own bamboo bike. Nikki, who bikes and gets outdoors and advocates for people of all different physical abilities being in the outdoors. And in these conversations, I was talking about the adventures that people had, but I was also talking about deeper life questions. I would ask them, how did their journey shape who they are now? I asked people what they thought authenticity means and what advice they'd give to their younger selves. And although we'd start talking about the outdoors, very quickly we'd end up talking about much deeper things that maybe don't always have space in other places. We'd talk about divorce, about miscarriages. We talked about being trans, about coming out. We talked about depression and mental health, anxiety and eating disorders, and so many important topics that really need space. As I carried on, I cycled up to near Bournemouth and I spoke to Layla, who's incredible and lives in a caravan in the woods. I cycled over to Shrewsbury and I spoke to Ruth, who's a ceramic artist and has a garden full of sculptures made out of shopping trolleys she's pulled out of her local river. I spoke to Annette, who's 68, lives in the lakes and has mountaineered her whole life and now has to go slower. She says that she can only go out walking for 5 hours at a time, no more than 2 days in a row, and instead has started wild swimming and goes wild swimming every day. I think now's probably a great time to tell you a little bit more about Gwen and my bike. So Gwen was £75 second-hand in lockdown, and she's been described in many different ways. Some people describe Gwen as old. Some people describe her as an old mountain bike. I've heard her described as an old hybrid bike. Sometimes she's just called an old bike. There's a bit of a funny story. When I was up in Glasgow, I had to get a new brake cable and I had to phone in advance and book the bike in because all the bike mechanics were so busy, and someone squeezed me in at 8 o'clock in the morning just because I was touring. So I turned up 8 o'clock in the morning, knocked on the door, and the man gave me a really funny look. And I said, "No, it's me, remember, from the phone." And he just looked at me and went, "That bike is not what I was expecting." And honestly, I had to take one look at myself and say, do you know, I'm not what most people are expecting either. I'll go back to the map, and what you'll see is that the lines in between each dot are a day. And you'll see that these days get a lot bigger. Restrictions started to come in and I was worried. I did this trip in between lockdown number 1 and lockdown number 2, and I could kind of sense that there was a second lockdown coming and that I just had to get back and finish the trip as quickly as possible. I did some of my longest, but also some of my most fun days, coming over between the Scottish borders and the Northumberland Moor, down through the very hilly County Durham. And then I did my first ever 100-kilometre day from County Durham down to Harrogate. It then gets a little bit squiggly again around the lakes. And that's because I managed to persuade my van driver and photographer to come and join me on the bike. Frit joined me and we had a lovely holiday, spending a week cycle touring together. And I showed her some great British sunshine. After that, I absolutely push it to get down to London again, interviewing so many amazing women on the way. Each day is basically another huge cycle stint and then another interview. I'm really aware that I have to push it to get through London as fast as I can with the lockdown coming. And I managed to make it just in time, squeaking through London on the Thursday with lockdown coming in on the Friday night. Now, if you're looking for somewhere to cycle, this will surprise you, but don't cycle from Kingston to Smarden. I loved so many of the places that I went to. I cycled through some phenomenal areas. I went through the New Forest, the Mendips, Wales, the lakes, Scotland, the peaks. It was stunning. Even the cities were beautiful. You know, I got into Liverpool and I was just looking up at the buildings like, wow, they were so tall. It was like I'd never been in a city before. Everywhere, no matter where you are in the UK, there is somewhere that is phenomenal to cycle, but just not Kingston to Smarden. It was the worst route of the trip. It was very urban, really busy roads. I had to run across horrible, huge roundabouts. And then I finally got into the countryside and it was thick, cloggy mud that stuck everywhere. I finally got out of the mud, onto some grass. Fantastic, it'll clean the tyres off. Except the grass had just been cut. So instead, I ended up with thick, cloggy mud and grass everywhere. But it wasn't that much further until I was back in the coast and in Shoreham by Sea. I'd really like to say that I was really excited and over the moon to finish, but actually I was mostly just sad that it was over. But I was also more than grateful to all the women who gave me their time and shared their stories as part of the trip. Really, their words were the fuel, and I just couldn't have done it. It wouldn't have been the same without them. I'm sharing the women's stories as a podcast. So each conversation I had is going out as a different podcast episode, and it's already available. I've launched the first 3 episodes. They're available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the usual podcast sites. So if you'd like to find out more about any of the women that I spoke to, please head over there.